On August 19, 1944, General Oberst Alfred Jodl stood at his headquarters in East Prussia, reviewing the latest reports filtering back from the collapsing Western Front. His staff had done the calculations. They'd measured the mathematics of stretched supply lines, those endless ribbons of transport that now ran over 400 miles from the Normandy beaches, all the way out to Patton's racing Third Army. The conclusion seemed obvious to every experienced officer in the room. The Americans have pushed too far too fast. Patton will have to halt soon, days, maybe just hours from now. No army in history could keep an armored force moving at these speeds without fuel running dry. From his position at Hitler's Wolf Lair headquarters, Jodl analyzed what every German general had learned the hard way through years of brutal experience. An armored division burned through fuel at a staggering rate, 150,000 gallons every single day when it was advancing at full speed. The Americans were now stationed 400 miles away from their supply bases. The math was unforgiving and inescapable. Patton's Third Army would grind to a halt within days, maybe sooner. This would give the Wehrmacht precious time to regroup and consolidate their positions, perhaps even hold the line until winter arrived. What Jodl didn't know, what none of the German general staff could have predicted, was that 125 miles away, an endless snake of trucks was already rolling eastward. Nearly 6,000 vehicles moving in an unbroken convoy, their headlights blazing defiantly against every military rule in the book, delivering 12,500 tons of supplies every single day. The Red Ball Express was coming. This logistics operation was so audacious, so completely outside the bounds of what German military thinking considered possible, that it would shatter every assumption the Wehrmacht held about mechanized warfare. Within 72 hours, those Patton tanks that were supposedly stuck in place would be crashing through German defensive positions. Within a week, they'd be liberating Paris. Within a month, they'd be standing at the German border itself. The finest military minds in the German High Command were about to receive a masterclass in American logistics. They were about to learn that warfare had changed in ways they couldn't yet comprehend. The lesson would be delivered by 23,000 truck drivers, 75% of them African-American soldiers, who transformed a one-way highway system into the most efficient military supply line the world had ever seen. The German General Staff's confidence that the Americans would fail stemmed from deep wells of military experience and recent hard lessons. The Wehrmacht had pioneered blitzkrieg warfare, revolutionized how armies coordinated tanks, infantry, and air power, and understood intimately the brutal limits that supply lines imposed on combat operations. They'd watched their own campaigns grind to a halt repeatedly when logistics couldn't keep pace with tactical momentum. In Russia, the advance had foundered not primarily from Soviet resistance, though that was ferocious, but from something simpler and more devastating: the sheer inability to supply forces across those vast, endless distances. German trucks broke down on Russian roads. The horse-drawn wagons that still comprised 80% of German military transport couldn't match the speed of panzer spearheads racing across the steppes. Railway gauge differences meant supplies piled up in mountains hundreds of miles behind the fighting. Generals who'd fought in Russia carried those scars with them. General Heinrich von Luttwitz, who would command 47th Panzer Corps come September 1944, had written just in July that the Americans faced the same impossible situation Germany had faced in Russia. Their mechanical advantage becomes a curse. Trucks require fuel and ammunition and replacement parts. They've advanced 400 miles in 30 days. History teaches what comes next. Paralysis. German intelligence had meticulously tracked American consumption rates. A single Sherman tank consumed fuel at a rate that meant barely half a mile per gallon on roads, even worse when moving across country. An infantry division needed 700 tons of supplies every 24 hours. An armored division required 1,000 tons daily. Patton commanded 12 divisions fighting across a 60-mile front. The mathematics pointed to one conclusion: 12,000 tons daily, transported 400 miles from the beaches over roads that had been badly damaged, through a transportation network that the Germans had systematically destroyed during their retreat. General Major Siegfried Westphal, who had become Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt in September, calculated on August 20th that even if the Americans had unlimited trucks, which they didn't, and perfect roads, which they certainly didn't, and no mechanical failures at all, which was impossible, they still couldn't sustain Patton's advance more than another day or two. Physical laws cannot be violated, not even by American industry. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, on August 25, 1944, in a requisitioned French chateau near Reims, Lieutenant Colonel Laurent A. Ayres of the Motor Transport Service faced a room full of skeptical officers. The mathematics he presented was stark and unforgiving. Patton's Third Army was consuming supplies at a rate faster than any army in history, advancing at speeds that demolished every logistical plan ever conceived. The normal system of scheduled convoys, rotating depots, staged distribution had collapsed under the weight of it all. "Gentlemen," Ayres announced, "we're going to create a one-way highway from the Normandy beaches all the way to the front lines. Every truck will run 20 hours out of every 24. No stopping except for fuel and genuine emergencies. We'll move 12,500 tons daily minimum." The name came from railway terminology. A Red Ball freight was an express shipment that got priority over everything else. The Red Ball Express would operate on the same principle: absolute priority, no delays, no exceptions. The technical specifications violated every principle of German military doctrine. 2 parallel one-way highways, one carrying loaded trucks heading forward, one returning with empty vehicles. 24-hour operations with headlights blazing, throwing away blackout discipline entirely. A no-stop policy except for fuel and mechanical failure. 5-minute intervals between convoys, maintaining an average speed of 35 miles per hour. Mobile maintenance units stationed every 50 miles. Military police checkpoints designed to pull any vehicle moving below 25 miles per hour. Colonel Charles O. Thrasher, commanding the advanced section of ADSEC, reviewed the numbers that seemed to defy every logistical textbook ever written. They would need 140 truck companies. At minimum, 5,958 vehicles operating at 90% efficiency. That's impossible by any calculation ever made. Yet within 36 hours, the impossible was running. On August 26, 1944, drivers from the 39th 16th Quartermaster Truck Company climbed into their vehicles. GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, nicknamed Deuce and a Half, loaded with 105mm artillery shells bound for Patton's guns 300 miles east. The demographic makeup of the Red Ball Express would have horrified anyone believing the racial theories the Nazis had promoted. Of the 23,000 drivers who would eventually work the route, approximately 75% were African-American soldiers serving in an army that was still segregated. These men who couldn't eat in white restaurants or use white facilities in much of America were keeping the most celebrated white general's army in motion. They were the invisible backbone of the American advance. The drivers developed their own culture within hours of the operation's launch. They painted slogans on their trucks: Custom Blood Bank, Hitler, Here We Come, Detroit to Berlin Express. They created their own traffic rules. A slow vehicle got pulled off immediately. Mechanical failures were shoved into ditches. Any truck moving below 20 miles per hour was considered a roadblock to be removed. By August 28th, German reconnaissance units began reporting something they'd never encountered before. Panzer reconnaissance elements radioed from positions overlooking the main Red Ball route. Continuous vehicle column, headlights visible for 20 kilometers, no spacing, no blackout discipline. Estimate 1,000 vehicles per hour. The Americans have abandoned all military precaution. This violated everything German military doctrine taught about warfare. Lights at night invited air attack. Continuous columns presented perfect targets for artillery. No spacing between vehicles meant one disabled truck could potentially halt an entire convoy. Yet the Americans seemed unconcerned about any of it. General Edgar Feuchtinger, commanding the 21st Panzer Division, personally observed the Red Ball Express from concealed positions on August 30th. His report to Army Group B headquarters reflected growing alarm and puzzlement. The enemy operates a supply system beyond our comprehension. Vehicles pass at 30-second intervals day and night without pause. They don't hide, don't disperse, Don't follow any rules we understand. It's not military science, it's mass production applied to warfare. What the Germans couldn't grasp was that American logistics operated on completely different principles. Where German doctrine emphasized concealment and careful procedures, Americans relied on overwhelming volume. Where Germans conserved vehicles and equipment, Americans assumed 20% mechanical failure and planned to absorb it. Where Germans followed strict military procedure, Americans improvised solutions every hour. The numbers achieved by the Red Ball Express defied German calculations of what logistics could accomplish. First week, August 25 to 31, 1944, nearly 90,000 tons delivered. Daily average of 12,848 tons. Round-trip distance of 686 miles. Nearly 6,000 trucks making 1.5 trips daily. Fuel consumed by the operation itself, 300,000 gallons. German logistics specialists who captured these numbers from American documents dismissed them as propaganda or exaggeration. But the numbers were genuine, and they were accelerating daily. By September 5th, the Red Ball Express had established a rhythm that seemed physically impossible to German logistics officers who still relied on horses for 80% of their transport needs. Fresh convoys departed every 5 minutes from the western terminus. Average convoy size, 67 vehicles. Load per vehicle, 5 tons standard, 7 tons when overloaded. Time to cover 350 miles one way, 14 hours average. Turnaround time at each end, roughly 2 hours. 5,000 vehicles in constant motion at any given moment. The Red Ball Express generated innovations constantly as drivers and mechanics solved problems that German military science would have deemed insurmountable. When trucks broke down, which happened about 1,800 times daily, mobile maintenance units performed roadside repairs. Mechanics developed a triage system, 15 minutes to fix it or push it off the road. Parts were cannibalized from vehicles deemed unrepairable. Engines were swapped using mobile cranes in 45 minutes. When the designated Red Ball route became congested, drivers created alternate paths around it. They commandeered French buses to move personnel and freed up trucks for cargo. They borrowed German vehicles, painted them olive drab, and pressed them into service. They built bypasses around destroyed bridges using rubble from bombed buildings as roadbed. The Germans, watching this apparent chaos that somehow produced order, couldn't comprehend what they were seeing. German doctrine emphasized careful planning, maintenance schedules, proper procedures followed to the letter. The Americans violated every principle, yet their system accelerated rather than collapsed. The most stunning revelation for German observers was American fuel management. The Red Ball Express consumed 300,000 gallons of gasoline daily just for its own operations. That was more fuel than many German armies received for all purposes combined. Yet fuel never ran short. The Americans had created a parallel marvel. Operation Pluto, pipelines under the ocean, laying fuel pipelines across the English Channel. By September 1944, fuel flowed through underwater pipes that German intelligence hadn't even detected. Forward fuel dumps were established every 25 miles along the Red Ball route. Tanker trucks ran their own parallel convoy system, ensuring no vehicle waited more than 10 minutes for refueling. General Major Walter Wallemont observed from aerial reconnaissance photographs and couldn't believe what he was seeing. The Americans have fuel dumps larger than our entire strategic reserves. They burn more gasoline moving gasoline than we allocate to entire panzer divisions. This isn't war as we understand it. It's industrial overflow applied to combat. The Red Ball Express didn't just supply Patton's advance, it multiplied his speed exponentially. German military doctrine calculated that an armored division could sustain 20 to 30 miles advance daily under optimal conditions. Patton's divisions, supplied by the Red Ball Express, averaged 40 to 60 miles daily for weeks on end. On September 1, 1944, the 4th Armored Division advanced 35 miles in morning operations. They halted for resupply at noon, and Red Bull trucks were waiting with fuel and ammunition. They advanced another 32 miles in the afternoon. This 67-mile single-day advance shattered German defensive planning, which had assumed maximum 30-mile daily advances. General Oberst Heinz Guderian, reviewing the reports in East Prussia, initially refused to believe them. No armored force can advance 60 miles daily for a week. Mechanical failures alone prevented. This must be propaganda or misidentification. But intercepted American radio traffic confirmed it. More disturbing for German commanders, the Americans were broadcasting their positions openly, without code, supremely confident in their ability to move faster than Germans could react. By September 5, 1944, German intelligence had compiled comprehensive reports on the Red Ball Express. The implications were catastrophic for Wehrmacht planning. Every assumption about American military capability required revision. The reports contained observations that simply defied German military science. Americans wasted vehicles prodigiously, abandoning damaged trucks rather than repairing them. Drivers operated on stimulants for days, violating every principle of personnel management. No camouflage discipline, making the entire system vulnerable to air attack that never materialized. Mechanical failure rates of 30% daily, simply overwhelmed by sheer redundancy and American industrial capacity. The sheer volume of fuel these convoys consumed would have ruined any European military's budget entirely. Field Marshal Walter Model's response made one thing clear: desperation was setting in. If intelligence reports held even a shred of accuracy, the Germans weren't facing a superior army. They were facing a superior civilization. The Americans didn't bother hiding their operations because they had nothing to fear. They squandered resources with abandon because their supplies seemed limitless. No conventional military strategy could overcome this kind of advantage. The drivers of the Red Ball Express paid prices that German observers could only guess at from a distance. Many operated for 72 hours straight, pushing through hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and Benzedrine pills to stay conscious. The operation claimed 300 driver casualties through accidents alone during its entire run. Trucks missed curves in thick fog. Vehicles flipped over crumbling roads. Engines overheated and burst into flames. Yet somehow morale stayed remarkably strong. These men, predominantly African American and denied basic rights back home, grasped something profound. They were making history with every delivery, every mile. They were disproving Hitler's racial theories with rubber and gasoline, with cargo beds and determination. When German officers were captured and interrogated, they spoke with genuine respect about what they'd witnessed. Colonel Hans von Luck, taken prisoner in September 1944, told his captors plainly that Germany knew the war was lost the moment they understood how the American supply system actually worked. "You break every rule we follow," he said. "You waste fuel, you abandon vehicles, you destroy drivers through exhaustion. Yet somehow you succeed through sheer, overwhelming abundance. You've industrialized warfare in ways we never imagined." The impact on German soldiers was crushing. Wehrmacht troops heard the sound of American trucks rumbling through the night, never stopping, never ending. The noise itself became an endless reminder of what they faced. While German riflemen had 3 rounds each, Americans were delivering ammunition by the millions. The constant mechanical drone of those engines worked on mines as much as any artillery barrage. The trucks themselves fascinated German engineers. The GMC CCKW 2.5-ton truck formed the backbone of this entire operation, a masterpiece of mass production. General Motors had built over 500,000 of these vehicles by war's end, more trucks than the entire German military possessed of any type combined anywhere in occupied Europe. The innovations in these vehicles stunned German technical officers. All-wheel drive came standard, not as a specialty option. Tire inflation systems that worked automatically. Waterproofing that allowed fording through water 30 inches deep. Engines that ran without fussing on low-grade fuel. Heating systems that actually functioned when winter came. What amazed Germans even more was the American approach to maintenance. Where Germans rebuilt and repaired engines meticulously, Americans simply replaced them. The Germans carefully rationed parts and components, but Americans discarded entire vehicles for minor damage. Germans relied on master mechanics, but Americans trained thousands of competent mechanics who could handle 80% of repairs themselves. When the front pushed eastward, the Red Ball Express adapted with a speed that left German planning officers bewildered. Men accustomed to weeks of preparation for major logistical shifts watched Americans reorganize in days. When the original route to Metz became inadequate, Americans established new Red Ball branches almost overnight. The White Ball Express ran from the Ruhr to Paris. The Green Diamond connected Cherbourg to rail transfer points. The Red Lion went from Rouen to Brussels and beyond. Each new route opened within 48 hours of approval. German staff officers needed weeks for similar operations. Americans simply painted route markers on roads, assigned trucks, and rolled forward. The presence of so many African-American drivers created genuine confusion for German racial theorists. Nazi ideology insisted blacks were inferior, incapable of technical work, lacking the initiative to function independently. Yet these same drivers were performing logistics feats that German forces couldn't come close to matching. The African-American soldiers felt the weight of this contradiction, and it drove them harder. Every mile proved the Nazis wrong. Every successful delivery was a rejection of Hitler's theories. They were fighting racism with truck keys and proving themselves through performance. Some German prisoners assigned to work alongside these drivers, loading cargo, discovered their entire worldview cracking apart. They worked beside African-American sergeants who calculated weight distribution faster than German engineers, who spoke better English than their own language instructors, who treated prisoners fairly despite everything Nazi propaganda had promised about how such men would behave. The reality contradicted everything they'd been taught. The Red Ball required infrastructure construction that Germans considered impossible under wartime conditions. American engineers built or reinforced 40 bridges, established 15 major fuel depots, created 26 maintenance stations, and constructed 8 temporary towns just to house drivers. All of this while operations never stopped running. The bridge at Metz had been deliberately demolished by German forces to cripple American logistics. German calculations suggested replacement would need a minimum of 6 weeks. American engineers threw up a temporary crossing in 14 hours, while Red Ball convoys detoured only 8 miles on hastily bulldozed bypass roads. German engineers watched this unfold with astonishment. No elaborate planning sessions, no detailed architectural drawings, just immediate action and results. One particular Red Ball achievement left German artillery officers genuinely shaken. The ammunition supply rates they managed exceeded anything the Germans had theoretically calculated as possible. American artillery units fired at will, a freedom no German unit had known since 1942. During operations against Metz in September 1944, the XX Corps artillery fired 100,000 rounds in a single day. The Red Ball Express delivered every one of those rounds, plus a 20% surplus. German artillery defending the same position was rationed to 50 rounds per gun daily. The disparity was staggering. American guns blazed continuously for hours, while German officers did the math and understood it required 50 truckloads of ammunition per hour to sustain. The Red Ball provided it without hesitation. Vehicle losses reached proportions that would have crippled any other nation's military. By late September, the numbers became staggering. Standard vehicle lifespan dropped to 1,000 miles. Daily replacement rates climbed to 30% of the entire fleet. 500 engines were replaced each week. 10,000 tires burned through weekly. Altogether, 5,000 vehicles were destroyed or abandoned. The operation never slowed. American production had already anticipated these losses. Fresh trucks arrived weekly at French ports by the hundreds. New drivers received 2 days of training before being thrown into convoy runs. German calculations showed Americans destroying more trucks in a week than the Wehrmacht possessed in all of France. Yet their capacity somehow grew rather than diminished. They had accomplished something Germans thought logically impossible: logistics that outpaced consumption. French civilians watching the Red Ball operations pass saw American abundance that contradicted years of German occupation scarcity. The psychological shift was immediate and powerful. Red Ball drivers, many of them African American, shared rations with French civilians despite regulations forbidding it. Children gathered at every stop hoping for chocolate, cigarettes, or soap. The contrast with German occupation was unmistakable. Americans gave away casually what Germans had rationed tightly. German intelligence filed reports recognizing the propaganda damage. The French population now believes American victory is inevitable, the reports noted. They point to these truck convoys as proof. Resistance activity has surged 400% along Red Bull routes. People who accepted occupation now actively oppose us. Early September 1944 brought the Red Bull Express its toughest test. Patton's Third Army had advanced so far that even this remarkable supply system struggled. Round-trip distances now exceeded 700 miles. Drivers were collapsing from fatigue. Vehicles were breaking down faster than repairs could manage. German intelligence detected the mounting strain. General Hasso von Manteuffel filed a report on September 8th. American supply lines are showing clear signs of collapse, he wrote. Convoy intervals have stretched from 5 minutes to 15. Vehicle speeds are dropping. This is our opportunity. But American flexibility surprised the Germans once again. Within 72 hours, the Red Bull Express reorganized completely. Intermediate transfer points cut individual runs down to 350 miles. Driver rotation systems kicked in. Forward maintenance bases opened. They doubled the number of trucks assigned. By September 12th, tonnage delivery had actually increased. The crisis that should have paralyzed everything made the system more resilient instead. Working alongside the Red Bull Express, Americans deployed another logistics solution Germans deemed impossible: large-scale aerial supply. 470 transport aircraft began flying critical supplies directly to frontline units, each carrying 3 tons. On September 16, 1944, German observers counted 900 transport flights in a single day, delivering 2,700 tons by air alone. The Luftwaffe at peak strength had managed 300 tons daily to Stalingrad and considered that maximum effort. Americans used transport aircraft like trucks, unconcerned with fighter escorts or fuel limitations. They simply accepted losses and buried those losses under overwhelming numbers. German military arithmetic couldn't compete with this industrial approach. The Red Bull operated under command principles that violated everything German hierarchy demanded. Junior officers made decisions reserved for generals in the Wehrmacht. Sergeants commanded operations larger than German colonels supervised. This decentralization baffled German observers. American logistics seemed to function without central control. Every lieutenant acted with general-level authority. Every sergeant commanded like a colonel. Chaos should have resulted. Instead came efficiency that German rigid hierarchy couldn't match. By October 1944, advancing railheads reduced Red Bull Express demand. The operation, designed to last 10 days, had run for 82 days, delivering 412,000 tons across 122 million ton miles. German commanders, now defending their own borders, reflected on what they had witnessed. Field Marshal Model wrote that Germany was not defeated primarily by American tanks or planes. "We were defeated by American trucks," he declared. The Red Bull Express revealed a fundamental truth. In modern warfare, logistics is strategy itself. The transition to rail transport unfolded as its own marvel. American railroad engineers reconstructed 1,000 miles of destroyed French rail lines, while Red Bull operations continued. They laid new track faster than Germans had destroyed it, often repurposing captured German rail equipment. The final statistics told a story that defied every German calculation about logistical possibility. 82 days of operation, 412,000 tons delivered, 122 million ton miles. An average fleet of nearly 6,000 vehicles, peaking at 7,000. 23,000 total drivers rotated through. 700,000 gallons of fuel consumed daily. 40,000 tons of ammunition for Patton alone. 15 million rations moved. 135,000 tons of medical supplies transported. German officers reviewing these figures in captivity admitted they had calculated American capability based on their own European experience. They had tripled their best performance and assumed that represented an American maximum. They were wrong by a factor of 10. Beyond these staggering numbers lay something deeper. The Red Bull Express shattered German confidence in their own military superiority. Wehrmacht officers who dismissed Americans as soft and dependent on machines watched those same Americans achieve logistics triumphs through sheer determination and industrial abundance. German prisoners stood at camp fences, counting passing Red Bull trucks, some weeping openly. They understood what it meant. Not just that Americans could supply their armies, but that they could waste more than Germany could produce. Their entire worldview was crumbling, one truck at a time. The Red Bull Express forced a reckoning within American military itself about something profound. The operation's stunning success rested overwhelmingly on African American soldiers still denied equal treatment, segregated, barred from combat roles. When General Eisenhower visited Red Bull operations in September 1944, he encountered the contradiction firsthand. His aide, Captain Harry Butcher, recorded the moment. The general stood watching colored drivers who had been working for 20 hours straight. He said, "These men are winning the war just as surely as any infantry. We need to reconsider many things." That success created momentum for integration that contributed to military desegregation 3 years later. African American soldiers had proved in France what they always knew. Given proper tools and opportunity, they matched anyone. The Red Bull was their battlefield, and they won decisively. German racial theorists struggled to explain the contradiction. Nazi racial science publications simply ceased mentioning American logistics operations. The evidence was too overwhelming to deny, too damaging to acknowledge. After the war, German military engineers studied Red Bull Express operations extensively, trying to understand how Americans accomplished what German theory said was impossible. The lessons learned fundamentally changed how military planners thought about supply and movement across the world. Volume could overcome inefficiency. Mechanical redundancy eliminated vulnerability. Decentralized execution enabled speed. Standardization multiplied capability. Human endurance had limits, but they proved far higher than anyone had previously assumed. General Franz Halder, who had served as chief of the German General Staff, reflected on this years later in 1950. He wrote simply that the Red Bull Express proved logistics determined strategy, not the other way around. Americans grasped this truth, though the Germans came to understand it far too late. Among the 23,000 Red Bull drivers, individual stories emerged that left German observers completely bewildered within their rigid military framework. These accounts came verified from official military records, not exaggeration or folklore. Corporal John L. Houston drove continuously for 48 hours straight, delivering ammunition to the 2nd Armored Division at Cambrai. His body screamed for rest. 3 times his eyes closed and his head dropped forward. 3 times other drivers revived him, slapped his face, forced him awake. He kept driving. Private Booker T. Washington faced a different crisis when his truck's brakes overheated catastrophically. Flames began consuming the vehicle from underneath. Protocol demanded abandonment. Military procedure was absolute. Instead, he gripped the steering wheel tighter, pressed the accelerator, and drove that burning truck 2 miles through the French countryside to a field hospital. Only when flames reached the cab did he throw himself clear. The medical supplies he carried saved wounded soldiers from both armies. These stories multiplied across thousands of incidents, revealing something fundamental about American military culture to German observers watching carefully from across their collapsing lines. Individual initiative flourished, calculated risk-taking was encouraged. Mission accomplishment mattered more than regulatory compliance. Desperately seeking to match American success, German forces attempted creating their own version of the Red Bull Express during late 1944. Operation Greif materialized during the Battle of the Bulge, incorporating plans to use captured American trucks for German supply chains. The effort collapsed almost immediately. German drivers simply couldn't maintain American velocities. German mechanics lacked the speed to repair American equipment quickly enough. German fuel supplies couldn't sustain the consumption rates Americans considered routine. Most fundamentally, Germans couldn't replicate the American attitude toward unlimited resources and expendable equipment. Oberst Otto Skorzeny, commanding Operation Greif, reported afterward with unmistakable frustration. "We captured 50 American trucks. Within 7 days, 30 had been disabled. Americans would have replaced them without hesitation. We tried desperately to repair them. That fundamental difference explains our defeat." The winter of 1944 through 1945 presented the Red Bull Express's ultimate examination. Freezing rain descended in sheets, snow piled on roads, ice coated every surface. German military doctrine declared wheeled logistics impossible below -10 degrees Celsius. Movement simply ceased at that temperature by every rational calculation. Yet the Red Ball Express continued rolling regardless. Drivers wrapped chains around tires. They poured alcohol into radiators. They kept moving through conditions that stopped everything else. Speeds declined from 35 to 15 miles per hour, but tonnage continued flowing. German observers watched with growing desperation as ice-covered convoys penetrated blizzards that had halted entire panzer divisions. The Americans had engineered a logistics system functioning regardless of weather, terrain, or enemy opposition. It possessed no elegance by German standards, it lacked German efficiency, but it remained absolutely unstoppable. In May 1945, when the war ended, captured German logistics officers were ordered to study Red Ball Express operations for historical documentation. Their conclusions proved unanimous and devastating to German professional pride. General der Infanterie Friedrich Schulz summarized their findings with grudging respect. The Red Ball Express represents warfare we never imagined. Americans created a temporary civilization, thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, millions of tons of supplies that existed solely to feed armies, then disappeared when no longer required. We constructed permanent infrastructure over years. They created superior temporary systems in mere days. The most perceptive analysis came from General Oberst Heinz Guderian, the father of German armored warfare itself. We invented blitzkrieg but never solved its fundamental limitation, logistics. Americans solved it through industrial excess we deemed impossible. The Red Ball Express was not merely a supply line, but a flowing river of material that drowned our forces in Allied abundance. The operation cost the United States approximately $100 million in 1944 currency. Vehicles destroyed, fuel consumed, roads damaged, French compensation claims. German staff officers, accustomed to managing scarcity, found the figure incomprehensible. Yet Americans considered it inexpensive. The operation enabled capturing 400,000 German soldiers, liberating France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and shortening the war by an estimated 6 months. Each day of continued war cost America $250 million. The Red Ball Express essentially paid for itself in a single day of shortened conflict. Lieutenant General John C. H. Lee, commanding all logistics for the European theater, stated with characteristic American pragmatism that they wore out 5,000 trucks and mobilized 23,000 men to destroy the German army in France. In any previous war, that would constitute catastrophic losses. In American industrial war, it represented acceptable overhead. An unexpected consequence of the Red Ball Express emerged in post-war civilian logistics development. Veterans who had driven returned to America, carrying experience operating the world's largest transportation network. These same men founded trucking companies. They designed interstate highway systems. They created the modern American logistics industry. Companies like Yellow Freight, Roadway, and Consolidated Freightways were established by Red Ball veterans who applied military logistics principles to civilian commerce. They had learned in France that volume beats efficiency, that speed beats perfection, that keeping trucks rolling continuously means moving the world. Military historians universally recognize the Red Ball Express as the decisive logistics operation of the entire European theater. Without it, advancing forces stalled. Paris fell weeks later than it did. German defensive lines held through winter. The operation validated American military doctrine, emphasizing logistics above tactics. While German officers studied cloud formations and battlefield maneuver, Americans studied Detroit assembly lines and railroad schedules. The Red Ball Express demonstrated that in modern warfare, the ability to supply forces determines victory far more than tactical brilliance. On September 15, 1944, Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, the supreme German commander in the West, received comprehensive intelligence on the Red Ball Express. After studying reports for hours, he summoned his staff. "Gentlemen," he announced, "we face something beyond military solution. Americans have created a supply system that renders distance irrelevant. Our strategy assumed their culminating point, that moment when advancing forces outrun their supplies. That point doesn't exist. They have revolutionized warfare, and we are fighting the last war. His operations officer, Oberst Hans Speidel, suggested attacking Red Ball routes with remaining Luftwaffe resources. Von Rundstedt's response revealed complete understanding of the mathematical reality. And what exactly shall we interdict? They operate 6,000 trucks. Even if we destroy 1,000, which we cannot, they'll replace them within a week. We would need to destroy 200 trucks daily simply to match their production capacity. We don't possess 200 aircraft total. Behind the statistics existed human stories that revealed American character to German observers. Drivers who hadn't slept for 3 days refused relief because their trucks might not survive the journey. Mechanics worked in freezing rain to maintain convoy momentum. Teenagers lied about their age to drive trucks. Such stories multiplied throughout the operation, creating mythology that demoralized German forces deeply. Americans weren't soft as propaganda portrayed them. They drove themselves harder than Germans drove horses, yet they did it voluntarily, not from fear. This made them far more dangerous than German doctrine had comprehended. The Red Ball Express became unintentional propaganda more potent than any planned operation. German soldiers could hear the convoys at night, endless streams of motors that never ceased. The sound itself constituted psychological warfare. German units reported hearing ghost convoys that demoralized troops as effectively as actual logistics demonstrated. The knowledge that Americans possessed unlimited supplies, while Germans rationed their final ammunition, created despair that undermined combat effectiveness systematically. American psychological warfare units recognized this impact. They began broadcasting truck engine sounds toward German lines when actual convoys weren't present. German units reported these phantom convoys as real, demonstrating the psychological damage the Red Ball Express had inflicted profoundly. In November 1944, as rail lines became partially restored, the Red Ball Express was officially discontinued, but its methods had revolutionized military logistics permanently. The concept of continuous, high-volume, wasteful but effective supply became embedded in American military doctrine. The final innovation involved the speed of dissolution. This massive operation, with 23,000 men, 6,000 vehicles, and hundreds of installations, disappeared completely in 72 hours. Troops were reassigned, vehicles were redistributed, routes returned to civilian use. Germans required months creating smaller operations and years dissolving them. Americans built what they needed, used it, discarded it, and built something superior. When German generals surrendered in May 1945, many specifically cited the Red Ball Express as demonstrating the hopelessness of continued resistance. General Hasso von Manteuffel stated at his interrogation with apparent relief, "When we understood your logistics capacity, we knew the war was lost. You could supply armies faster than we could destroy them. The Red Ball Express was a weapon against which we possessed no defense." Field Marshal Albert Kesselring, among Germany's most capable commanders, was asked what most surprised him about American forces. "Not your tanks," he responded, "not your planes, your trucks. The Red Ball Express showed us that you had militarized your entire society's production capacity. We were fighting your factories, not merely your soldiers." The final statistics of the Red Ball Express stand as testimony to American industrial warfare. Total cargo delivered reached 412,193 tons. Total distance covered reached 122 million ton-miles. Trucks employed averaged 5,958 daily, peaking at 7,000. Drivers involved totaled 23,000. Over the last 82 days, fuel consumption reached 57 million gallons. Tires wore out completely. Vehicles were destroyed, 5,000 plus. Total cost reached $100 million. German divisions defeated through supply advantage numbered 47. Estimated war days shortened reached 180. These numbers transcended mere military operations. They represent the moment when warfare changed forever, when industrial capacity became more important than tactical brilliance, when logistics determined strategy rather than merely supporting it. In 1994, marking the 50th anniversary of D-Day, the United States Postal Service issued a commemorative stamp honoring the Red Ball Express at the National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. The ceremony recognized the operation that had been overshadowed by combat operations, yet proved equally decisive in Allied victory. Veterans who attended spoke of their pride in an operation proving American industrial might and individual determination could overcome any obstacle. They had driven through exhaustion. They had driven through mechanical failure. They had driven through weather-stopping armored divisions. They were black soldiers mostly, segregated, discriminated against, denied recognition during the war itself, yet they had delivered victory at 35 miles per hour. The Red Ball Express proved that in modern warfare, logistics isn't support, it is the main effort. The operation demonstrated that industrial democracy could mobilize resources on a scale totalitarian efficiency couldn't match. German generals who had dismissed American logistics were silenced by 6,000 trucks delivering 12,500 tons daily across 700 miles of liberated France. They had assumed Americans would follow European precedent, conserving resources, advancing cautiously. Instead, Americans created a logistics tsunami that drowned German forces in Allied abundance. The operation's success came not from military genius, but from American characteristics Germans never understood: industrial excess, mechanical aptitude, improvisational skill. Most importantly, the initiative of individual soldiers making independent decisions that in the Wehrmacht would require field marshal approval. In his memoirs, General George S. Patton, whose Third Army was the primary beneficiary of the Red Ball Express, wrote the ultimate tribute. The truck drivers of the Red Ball Express deserved as much credit for Germany's defeat as any combat unit. They drove through exhaustion. They drove through mechanical failure. They drove through weather-stopping armor. Without them, Third Army doesn't move. Without movement, we don't win. They were black soldiers mostly, segregated, discriminated against, denied recognition. Yet they won the war as surely as any rifleman. History must record this truth. That truth stands as the final testament to the Red Ball Express. 23,000 mostly African-American drivers operating 6,000 trucks on a one-way highway to victory achieved what German military science declared impossible. They supplied advancing armies faster than physics should allow. They maintained tempo beyond human endurance. They proved that in modern warfare, the side with the most trucks defeats the side with the best tactics. German generals had dismissed American logistics as wasteful, undisciplined, impossible to sustain. 82 days later, those same generals surrendered to armies supplied by the Red Ball Express, finally understanding that American trucks had defeated German tanks, that industrial abundance had overwhelmed military excellence, that logistics had become strategy. The Red Ball Express ended on November 16, 1944, but its impact echoed through military history. It proved that in the industrial age, victory belongs not to the bravest soldiers or brightest generals, but to the nation delivering the most supplies, the fastest. German generals who dismissed American logistics in August 1944 signed surrender documents in May 1945, defeated by 23,000 truck drivers who revolutionized warfare at 35 miles per hour. Their story deserves its place among the great military operations of history, not because it was elegant or efficient, it was neither, but because it worked. The Red Ball Express kept armies rolling, it kept Germans retreating. It proved that in modern war, the convoy of trucks matters more than the column of tanks. The highways of France still bear the scars of the Red Ball Express, routes worn by overloaded vehicles, bridges hastily repaired, roadsides littered with abandoned equipment. But the greatest monument to the operation is the speed of Allied victory. Every day the war shortened, saved thousands of lives. The Red Ball Express shortened it by months. In the end, German generals who dismissed American logistics learned the hardest lesson of modern warfare. Amateurs talk tactics, professionals talk logistics, Americans talk trucks. The Red Ball Express was America talking very loudly indeed in the roar of 6,000 engines that never stopped, carrying democracy and destruction at 35 miles per hour down a one-way road to victory. The last word belongs to a German officer whose name is lost to history, quoted by a Red Bull driver at the 1994 commemoration. Standing beside a Belgian road, watching the endless convoy of American trucks, the officer said in accented English to his captors, "We prepared for everything. Your tanks, your planes, your ships. We never prepared for your trucks. How do you defeat an enemy who has more trucks than soldiers?" The answer rolled past him at 5-minute intervals, driven by exhausted Americans who were rewriting the rules of warfare one delivery at a time. The Red Ball Express had made logistics into strategy, supply into victory, and trucks into the most decisive weapon of the European war. German generals stopped laughing when they understood this truth. But by then, Paris was already at their gates, supplied by the greatest logistics operation in military history.